Ask any small child what the greatest nation in the world is, and they will undoubtedly tell you that it's the nation to which they belong. Human beings have a natural inherent bias towards the group that they belong to, and subsequently the nation into which they're born. Believe it or not, this bias naturally creeps in even to the most sophisticated of academic disciplines such as history, religion, and philosophy. This bias is known as Eurocentrism, or sometimes Western centrism, to include the dominance of the United States in the 20th century and the influence of American culture. Western centrism is a view that holds that European or American civilization or culture is superior over and against other civilizations or cultures, that Western civilization is for various reasons inherently better. In terms of a cognitive bias, Western centrism rears its head with claims that Western civilization is quote-unquote the best, or at least better than other non-Western civilizations. What the best means in this case is often left undefined by the proponent of this position. Usually it's taken to mean the best in terms of military strength, in terms of conquest, in terms of scientific achievement. There's a whole host of factors that come into play here. Western centrism can lead to several logical fallacies because it is oftentimes rooted in a form of confirmation bias. The proponents of Western centrism believe that Western civilization is the best, largely because they are only considering evidence from Western civilization. That is, they're ignoring counterexamples. They're ignoring data that might point to the opposite conclusion. Western centrism can come in a variety of forms and in various different academic disciplines, including historical, philosophical, or religious arguments. The issue, as I mentioned before, is that these arguments can lead to various logical fallacies and incorrect thinking, largely because of the blatant cognitive bias that's on display. I bring this up because the argument that I want to examine today is a conversation between Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro, in which Shapiro will make a historical argument that is deeply rooted in Western centrism and that falls prey to the biases and the fallacies that I've just mentioned. So let's take a look. So as I said in the introduction to this video, the video that we're going to watch is a conversation between Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro. And supposedly the topic has to do with the origins of morality. Although the argument that Shapiro gives at the beginning of the video will kind of sidetrack that discussion into, loosely speaking, a historical conversation about the relationship between religion and ethics, and eventually Harris will kind of detour the conversation to talk about the relationship between science and religion, and then kind of at the end we'll circle back to this original topic, which is kind of the core argument that Shapiro puts forward, which is that the ethical system developed by the West, specifically the rights-based ethical system, has its origins and its roots in Judeo-Christian values, and that these sort of represent the pinnacle of civilization, that Western civilization as we see it today. And this is a little bit difficult to talk about because Shapiro is not really clear at exactly when he's talking about or what exactly he's referring to, but that civilization, Western civilization as we see it today, is the pinnacle of moral achievement. So let's jump into
the religious view. Obviously, there are certain things that I believe are capable of understanding by any sentient human being. So I don't believe that all human beings in the absence of religion are immoral people who go around murdering their neighbors and raping their sisters. I think and in fact, this is pretty well embedded in even Judaic philosophy, the idea that there is a sort of natural law theology where you as just a normal person know not to kill people and know not to steal and know to set up courts of law. This is what they call the seven commandments to Noah. But the idea is that anyone can basically discover these things. And there are universals across culture about you're not supposed to murder your brother.
So to kind of set the stage for Shapiro's argument, he's going to introduce what in theology is generally referred to as the two books theology, the two books view of nature. So the idea here is that revelation from God can be divided up into two general categories, two general books. First is the book of Scripture, as is revealed in the Bible, Torah, or in the case of the New Testament, or in the case of Christianity, the New Testament. Revelation is one of the books. Revelation is a message that is directly given by God to the people. Other way in which God reveals himself, according to this tradition, is through the book of nature. And according to this idea, God's existence and certain attributes of God might even be knowable via nature, that through nature, through the study of nature, that we can come to know certain things about the divine. And what Shapiro is saying is that there's a certain level of morality, a certain level of ethics that's available to anyone and everyone, even if they haven't received divine revelation from God. So from here, he's going to take this argument a step forward to say that it's specifically the revelation that was given to the Jewish people, and by extension, it's a little strange here because Shapiro will include Christians in there, but he's going to exclude Muslims. I'm not sure the rationale behind that, but basically that the revelation given to Jewish people and then the revelation given through Jesus to Christians will kind of fall on this moral continuum of development that will lead to the development of civilization and of rights-based ethics, which he's going to hold as the quantitative standard by which we can judge other civilizations and other cultures.
But the biblical reading is that to reach a more sophisticated level of morality that leads to a sort of right-based society we see here, you at least need the catalyzing enzyme of a Judeo-Christian religion in order to get here. That would, I think, be the most rationalistic argument on behalf of Judeo-Christian values.
But where is here again?
Here would be a civilization that values individual rights above the values of the collective, that says that people are to be treated, to use the biblical phrase, as made in the image of God, that we should treat individuals as made in the image of God. That does not happen in the absence of a Judeo-Christian value system. That's the religious argument. Although
that is more of a historical argument.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's a rationalistic argument, because the deeply religious argument would be God said so, so do it. Right. But that's not the argument that I think is the most compelling.
So we have a lot going on in that little exchange that just happened. And again, it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly what Shapiro's saying, because he's not super clear in terms of what exactly he's referring to. But the gist of the argument, if I'm hearing this correctly, is that in order to get to the rights-based civilization that we, and by we, he seems to be referring to Western civilization exclusively, that in order to get to the rights-based civilizations that we see, what he says here, that this has to be predicated on Judeo-Christian values. And that kind of inversely, and that where we are at in terms of nowadays, better by some intangible standard that he hasn't quite specified, better than other places. It's a strange argument. And again, it's not quite clear what exactly we're talking about, when we're talking about, but there is an evaluation. To get back to what I was talking about in the introduction of this video, there is a sort of Western centrism that's being posited, a Western centrism based on the sort of values that are embraced and adopted by the West. And of course, Shapiro is saying those values are inherently Judeo-Christian. Now, as I also pointed out in the introduction of this video, one of the problems with Western centrism is the issue of confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is a problem because it blinds you to other evidence that might contradict or go against what you're saying here. So on a fundamental level, the most basic objection that we can give, that Harris does not give in this conversation, surprisingly, is the West the only value and only rights-based civilization? And the answer to that is obviously no. There have been several subsequent countries since the establishment of rights-based ethics, and the combination of rights-based ethics with political systems that we saw during the English, American, and French revolutions. There have been other non-Western countries that have adopted that. Now, Shapiro's objection to that claim might be obviously, well, yes, they've adopted it afterwards, but it's only in the quote unquote West that we see the development and origin of rights-based ethics. And I would also call that into question. Now, to be clear, as we'll talk to a little bit later, this specific type of rights-based ethics that Shapiro is talking about was developed exclusively by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who are two British thinkers in the 17th century. So in that sense, yes, but that raises another problem that we'll come back to. However, this idea of natural law and by extension, natural rights appears in non-Western countries. The most obvious example of this that I can think of off the top of my head is the system of natural law that we find evident in classical Chinese civilization. I have other videos on Chinese philosophy if you're interested. As I outlined there, the two major classical schools of Chinese thought are Confucianism and Taoism. And within the tradition of Confucianism specifically, there's a very, very rich tradition of natural law. I have an article here that talks about the history of natural law in Chinese legal thought. So first and foremost, in terms of raw historical data, what Shapiro is saying here is not quite true, but let's give Shapiro the benefit of the doubt and say that he's exclusively speaking of the system of natural law ethics that was developed during the Enlightenment by Hobbes and Locke. Okay, so to Shapiro's point, yes, Hobbes and Locke are British thinkers and did develop the natural rights-based system that he's talking about. What's not so clear is Shapiro's understanding of historical causation. What he seems to be suggesting is that both Hobbes and Locke owe their existence, owe their development to the Judeo-Christian system, to Judeo-Christian values. So I've been throwing around a lot of terms that relate to kind of what we would call meta-ethics, broadly speaking, that I need to just briefly clarify here. And I'll make a separate video on ethics later on to talk about these in more detail. But if you remember, the beginning of the conversation is about the origins of morality, although that's not at all what we're talking about now. But Shapiro's is making reference to what he calls rights-based ethics. So within meta-ethics, so we have ethics. Ethics is divided into meta-ethics and applied ethics. Meta-ethics are the large, grand theories of ethics. And generally speaking, we have three major theories of ethics: deontology, utilitarianism, and virtue ethic. Now, rights-based ethics is a particular style theory of ethics that develops closely related to political thought and political philosophy in the 17th century that kind of becomes its own category. The two major works on rights-based ethics were written by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, which he wrote in 1651, and to follow that up was John Locke's Two Treatises of Government in 1690. What's confusing about Shapiro's claim here, it's not exactly clear here how he thinks that Judeo-Christian values are related, or in his case, he's arguing that it led to the development of rights-based ethics. And this brings up, especially within because this is a historical argument, as Harris points out, this brings up the historical issue of causation. And the main question I would ask here is that true? Did Judeo-Christian values in some way, shape, or form cause or lead to the development of rights-based ethics? And it's not very clear to me how exactly that is the case. Now, to explain a little bit about what I mean here, let's talk a little bit about what historical causation looks like. So causation plays a very big role in historical narratives and historical analysis about particular events. And just broadly speaking, when I say that something caused another thing, what I mean by that is, just to use basic understanding, that event A is caused by, when I'm speaking within the context of history and I say that one thing caused another thing, what I mean by that is that there's some sort of relation between these two events, so that the prior event in some way, shape, or form influenced, led to, or sort of set the stage for the preceding event. Now, this can be relatively simple if we're talking about concrete events and instances, But it gets a little bit more complex when we're talking about intellectual history or the history of thought, which is what we're talking about here. But to illustrate what I'm saying, a good historical question might be, what caused World War II? And as we can see here, just in this simple little graph, and this is even I would say this is a simplification of what happened here, is that major events such as World War II, have numerous causes, ranging from concrete things such as Adolf Hitler taking power in Nazi Germany to more abstract ideas and concepts such as nationalism. Where exactly does nationalism come from? Nationalism has concrete roots in political movements, yes, but it also has a more theoretical framework in terms of philosophy and political dialogue that's taking place, less intangible things. So an event like World War II is going to have a whole host of causes, a whole host of reasons for why it happened, when it happened, that are linked to all sorts of various things, from abstract ideas such as nationalism to very concrete political situations that occurred, such as the rise of Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. So I bring up this issue of causation with respect to Shapiro's claim because a big component of historical causation is time. We are, after all, talking about history. And historically speaking, in order for me to claim that one thing caused another, there has to be at least some relevance to the temporal location of those two events. The rise of Hitler in Germany during the 1930s is seen as a cause for World War II because the 1930s preceded the 1940s. They're historically related, and also because Adolf Hitler is the primary aggressor, at least at the start of World War II. So you can kind of see almost intuitively how those two things are related. That's not to say that things further apart in time cannot be related. You could ask, for example, about what caused the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century. And to answer that question about the cause of the fall of Constantinople, you can go all the way back to the 6th century to talk about the rise of Islam. And those two things are tangentially related to each other. Constantinople fell because of Islamic armies. So there is somewhat of a connection, but the further apart the historical events, you really need to build a very strong case for how they're related. And in Shapiro's case, he's saying that Judeo-Christian values led to the development of rights-based ethics. You're talking about a historical gap of, at minimum, 1,500 years since the beginning of Christianity in the 1st century and the development of rights-based ethics in the 16th century. And the reason why that gap is so important is because obviously a lot can happen in 1,500 years, which leads me to the third point, the third kind of logical point that I want to make here, which is that this is a highly reductionistic reading of history. The idea that rights-based ethics only developed as a result of Judeo-Christian values is to ignore a whole host of causes that takes place in between those two things happening. And in historical reasoning, we have to be very, very careful when positing cause and effect, especially when we're reducing the particular cause of an event to a single thing, because history is almost never that simplistic. History is immensely complicated, and how this could be problematic, I'd like to illustrate that by asking this question. This is a common test question that you might see, give you flashbacks to your middle high school days. What caused the American Civil War? Now, what would your answer to this question be? A, states' rights. B, political differences between North and South. C, economic differences between the North and the South. D, slavery. The problem with framing this question in such a simplistic way is that the actual answer would be something along the lines of E, all of the above. But more specifically, slavery kind of incorporates all of those different aspects. So when we reduce historical causes to a single thing, such as in Shapiro's case, Judeo-Christian values, By ignoring other things, we run the risk of oversimplifying history. And the danger about oversimplifying historical causes is that it can lead to false justification for why certain things happen and a misunderstanding of the rich and varied causes for why something actually developed. So let's continue on with the video.
Actually convincing. It's an argument from authority, which of course is not particularly convincing. So I tend to make the historical argument, which is that history brought us to that the reason we are at this point in history is because without that particular catalyzing enzyme, you don't get what you have here, which is why the West and Western civilization crop up in a Judeo-Christian system, but don't crop up in, for example, Islamic countries, and Islam's been around for 1,000 years. So what do you...
Yeah, I just don't understand the point that's being made here. Western civilization only appears within a Judeo-Christian context. The issue with that statement is it's the equivalent of saying Western civilization only appears in the West. Yeah, that's true, but Judaism and Christianity are both adopted. Now, they did get their start within what we would call the Middle East, the non-West, by Shapiro's standard, because according to Shapiro, Islam is not part of the West. Islam is separate and distinct, both in values and in culture from the West. But the statement that he just made is basically Western civilization only appears and comes from the Western religious tradition. That's like on the one hand, that's a tautology. Western civilization only comes from the West. On the other hand, it's what exactly are you trying to say there? I don't know. All right, let's continue on.
Here, meaning like why in Judeo-Christian civilization, but not Islamic civilization, because you mentioned rediscovery of Aristotle and reuse of Aristotle in 10th and 11th centuries was really beginning, in the Islamic world long before Aquinas really repopularized it in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Yeah. Well, one, I think it's, from my point of view, it's impossible to ignore the influence of Islam. I mean, Islam is its own ideology and set of dogmatisms that are inflexible and at odds with the spirit of science fundamentally. And despite the fact that there was a brief period where there seemed to be some, happy convergence between scientific and mathematical insight and Islam, for the most part, Islam has been hostile to, a real intellectual life, and in a way that Christianity was hostile even when the scientific worldview was struggling to be born in.
Okay, so we just have one confusing, strange argument after another. In this case, Harris is going to be purporting a claim which is commonly referred to as the conflict thesis, which talks about the relationship between science and religion that has been largely rejected by academics for about the past 50 years or so. So the conflict thesis is a theory that relates to the history of science and religion that addresses the relationship between science and religion. And the conflict thesis, as the name suggests, says that the relationship between science and religion, historically speaking, has been one of conflict. That since it began, that science has had issues with religion, or more specifically, that religious institutions have attempted to put down, to stifle, or to stop the development of science. Harris is espousing a version of that here by saying that Islam and Islamic civilization has contributed to that conflict thesis. Now, I can't stress enough how, just like Shapiro is giving us an extraordinarily reductionistic picture of history, so is Harris. But in this case, it's not just reductionistic, it's also, again, to go back to what I said about Shapiro's argument, empirically based on the historical evidence, just flat out wrong. Yes, you can point to some specific instances in which scientific practitioners were either marginalized or in even some cases persecuted by religious institutions. But the idea that the two, science and religion, are inherently in conflict with each other is a dramatic misreading of what actually happened historically speaking. So the period of time that Harris refers to here in that discussion, the Islamic Golden Age, and just to give you a sense of how Harris is misreading the history of Islam, he calls this a brief period of time. Now, the Islamic Golden Age lasted from about the 8th century CE to the 13th century CE. So it lasted roughly for 500 years. To give you a sense of time scale, the United States, if we say that the United States started in 1776, the United States has existed for about 240 something years. So the Islamic Golden Age lasted twice the length that the United States has existed. By Harris's account, this is a brief period of time. I don't know where this is coming from. But the Islamic Golden Age is widely recognized as a time of economic and as well as scientific flourishing within Islamic civilization and culture. It ended, of course, with the invasion of the Mongols, but Harris's picture here is that after the Islamic Golden Age it ended, that Islam was somehow at odds with science. That's a complete misrepresentation of what happened. The Islamic Golden Age ended not out of choice, but by invasion. And yes, we don't have the same sort of scientific activity happening in Islamic civilization at that time, but this is largely because we're entering into an era of economic and political instability that will happen in the region for a number of years to come. To add on to that misrepresentation, we really don't see anti-scientific attitudes being developed in Islamic countries until the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the early 20th century. And even then, we're only talking about anti-scientific attitudes in some places, not in all places. And this is certainly not an attitude that's adopted by every single Muslim everywhere in the world. Just like Christianity and Judaism, there are Islamic scientists. And there's nothing inherent within Islam that is inherently anti-scientific, just like in those other religions that I mentioned. The conflict thesis has largely been debunked because if you look at the history itself, there's just so many counterexamples to that narrative, to the point where the narrative itself just becomes meaningless. Okay, so let's move on to what I think is an actual legitimate objection that Harris raises to Shapiro's original argument.
The Bible, in my view, can't be the real repository of our moral wisdom in any sense, because when you go to read it, you are forced to ignore certain passages or reinterpret them rather aggressively to conform to what you now in the 21st century have every reason to believe is good or a direction worth going socially. So, it is just an inconvenient fact that slavery is endorsed in the Bible. It's explicitly endorsed in the Old Testament, and it's certainly not repudiated in the New, right? And Jesus told slaves to serve their masters and to serve their Christian masters especially well. So there's no place in the Bible where you can get a truly compelling case against slavery, because the creator of the universe clearly expected slavery to be a human institution.
Well, except for abolitionists finding enough inspiration in the Bible to use it as their main text.
But they did that despite what's in the Bible.
Well, I think that is, I mean, I don't want to, this shouldn't sound insulting because it's not meant as an insult. I think that from a religious point of view, that's a simplistic reading of the Bible's role in human affairs, meaning that...
Okay, so we have the example of slavery being brought up, and I think Harris is making a good, genuine objection here, but then the conversation kind of devolves into how we are to interpret those passages from the Bible that talk about slavery, and kind of a more so a theological objection. But I want you to remember Shapiro's original claim. His original claim was that Western civilization is the pinnacle of an ethical, moral society, and that the reason why it's the pinnacle of an ethical, moral society is because it's predicated on Judeo-Christian values. There's a strong objection here. So let's forget all of the objections that I've just raised previously. Let's forget how this argument has some major logical and historical issues, and just accept the argument as it is, that what we have in the West is the pinnacle of ethics and morality, and as a result is the pinnacle of civilization. If that's the case, how do you explain the historical fact that the largest genocide and acts against and violations of human rights that have ever occurred in human history were done, perpetuated, and carried out by Western civilization. This is a huge objection. Shapiro's claim is that Judeo-Christian values led to the instantiation of individual rights, which was codified in systems like the United States government, the Bill of Rights, and the US Constitution, and that this is what we ought to be striving for. Yet, that same government carried out the systematic extermination and genocide of Native Americans throughout the 18th and 19th century. On top of that, that same government instituted the most hideous form of slavery which has ever existed within history, with the enslavement and subsequent demeaning of African Americans. And the extending that further, the atrocities that were committed in the 20th century, such as the Holocaust, the massive casualties that resulted from World War I and World War II, the greatest amount of casualties ever seen from combat throughout the entirety of human history, were all done by these Western civilizations. So even if we accept Shapiro's argument, there are some huge skeletons in that closet that I'm not sure that his argument, to use Harris' words, is doing what he thinks it's doing. All right, that's all I got from this video. I hope that you enjoyed that breakdown and the exploration of ideas that we had together. Feel free to leave your thoughts about this conversation in the comments of this video. Let me know if you found this video interesting, and I'll see you all next time.